Chapter 16. She Got Married. The elderly woman in Keira's arms was looking pale, with her arms hanging limply. At the sight, Lewis wasted no time and strode toward them. Though he appeared calm, he was filled with anxiety. The elderly woman was the one person he was closest to in this world. Over the past few years, her health had been deteriorating. Their family doctor had even hinted to old Mrs. Horton that she might not make it through the year. He couldn't lose her. When Keira saw him approaching, she drew her own conclusions. However, it wasn't the right time to discuss it. She quickly blurted out,
Granny just had a heart attack. She has used all her nitroglycerin pills and urgently needs medication.
After a pause, she added,
She'll be okay once she gets medicine.
Lewis nervously pressed his lips together. He reached out to take the elderly woman from Keira and darted into the Horton family home without looking back. Keira didn't follow inside. Her leg was still being held by Poppy. Isla watched Lewis from behind with uncertainty. A strong feeling of unease stirred her.
Is that really old Mrs. Horton? How could old Mrs. Horton be with Keira? That woman is the grandmother of Keira's husband.
Poppy released Keira and stood up, dusting off her clothes as she said,
Mr. Horton looks so worried. He's probably afraid of causing a real disaster. If someone were to die here, the Horton family won't look good when word gets out.
She shot Keira a spiteful glare.
She's banking on this to rush into the Horton house while carrying that decrepit old woman, isn't she?
Isla frowned. It could be. Keira's punk husband couldn't possibly be Lewis, right? She was probably overthinking. Just then, the front door of the Horton house opened, and Jake stepped out. Isla's eyes lit up as she said playfully,
Oh, Jake, you could have just waited for me at the parking lot. Why did you come all the way to the front door?
Jake was clearly irritated. Isla had texted him that she was almost there, but carrying too many gifts, and asked him to come pick her up. He waited in the parking lot for a long time, and when she didn't show up, he came out to check. His eyes fell on Keira, and he paused mid-step. But in the next moment, his previous impatience melted away, replaced by a softness. He said gently to Isla,
Well, it's your first visit. I was afraid you might get lost.
Isla ran to him excitedly and grabbed his arm as if staking her claim. She cooed to him,
Oh, Jake, you're so nice.
Testing the waters, she asked,
Is old Mrs. Horton at home?
Yes.
Has she been home all day? Did she go out at all?
Well, she has not been well for a while and has mostly been resting at home.
Old Mrs. Horton lived on her own in a separate country yard and didn't like being disturbed. Jake's words sounded casual, but Isla mistook them for truth and was instantly relieved. Jake unabashedly eyed Keira. He didn't miss a single change in her expression, trying to find some hint of jealousy, envy, or resentment. But there was none. Not a trace. A sullen look gradually cast over his face. Keira was more worried about the old lady's health and paid no attention to the couple's display of affection. At this point, she was reasonably sure that the grandson she chatted with was Lewis. She looked at the imposing gate, wondering if she would be stopped if she tried to enter now. Suddenly, her view was obscured. Jake stood in front of her, bluntly asking,
Keira, are you here to see me because you've had a change of heart?
Keira was dumbfounded. With a cold laugh, Jake spat out words filled with venom.
If you had given in, a phone call would have been enough. Who allowed you to come to the Horton house? Do you think you, an illegitimate daughter, even deserve to set foot here?
Keira pressed her lips together. Jake softened at her stubbornness.
If you want to have a look inside, I can...
Before he could finish his sentence, Isla cut him off.
Jake, you misunderstood. Keira is waiting for her husband's grandmother. The old lady just had a sudden heart attack, and Mr. Horton rushed her inside for emergency treatment.
Jake was taken aback.
Husband?
Isla chuckled.
Indeed, I didn't get a chance to tell you. Keira is married.
Jake's eyes suddenly reddened as he gnashed his teeth.
Keira, who is he?
His response gave the impression of a man catching his partner cheating in the act. Keira gave him a mocking look and said,
Jake, who my husband is has nothing to do with you.
His voice spiked as he shouted back,
What do you mean it's none of my business? I want to see who dares you to marry you without my consent.
Isla hastily replied,
From what I've heard from Kira's mother, he's just a street punk.
Jake clenched his fists, not choosing his words, as he spat out.
So, you decide to disgrace yourself. Fine. A bastard girl and a punk. You truly make a perfect match.
Isla continued to fan the flames.
Keira must be pretty resentful. That's why she keeps pestering Mr. Horton.
Keira shot back in a cold, mocking laugh.
Isla, for someone who considers herself a lady, it's surprising that your mind is filled with such filthy thoughts. Can't you think of anything else?
With a sigh, she said,
Keira, I understand you're seeking revenge on me and Jake, but Mr. Horton is already married. You shouldn't meddle in someone else's marriage.
Jake exploded when he heard this. He had been waiting for Keira to call him these past few days and beg for his forgiveness. He was even willing to give her a second chance if she did so. Turns out she has already moved on. He flew into a rage.
Now I understand why your husband's grandmother had a heart attack at my doorstep. You were here to visit my uncle, weren't you, Keira? How could you be so shameless?
He was steaming, seething with rage. He pointed at Keira and told the door guard,
See that? Remember this face. Don't let her step foot inside the Horton house.
Isla lowered her gaze to hide the smirk playing at the corners of her lips. After all, she still had some say in the entrance to the Horton house. Meanwhile, a butler from the Horton family emerged from the house. His gaze swept over the crowd, finally landing on Keira.
Miss Keira, the master invites you in.
Isla froze. Jake looked up, dumbstruck. On the other hand, Keira glanced at the door guard, a teasing smile playing on her lips.
So, can I go in now?
The door guard glanced anxiously at Jake, then without hesitation opened the door for Keira. He did know who had the final say in the Horton family. The Hortons' house was huge. Inside the gate, a buggy was available to shuttle Keira directly to the main building's entrance. The butler said respectfully,
Madam is fine now. She and the master are waiting for you in the drawing room.
Relieved, Keira got out of the buggy. She noticed the Olsen family's BMW X7 parked not far away in the parking lot. With Jake leading the way, Isla and Poppy strode menacingly toward Keira, meeting her just outside. Poppy glared venomously at her.
Mr. Horton probably asked you to come pick up your grandmother here. After you do that, make sure you leave promptly. Don't let a nasty creature like you smear the Horton house's carpets.
As they entered the drawing room together, they saw old Mrs. Horton sitting upright on the head sofa. The elderly lady glared at them, fuming.
Who are you calling a nasty creature?
Chapter 17. Humiliate Isla. The little old lady was now adorned in luxurious clothing, though she still looked a little pale. Lewis was sitting frostily to her left. To her right was a man over 60. It was Lewis's father. A middle-aged couple in their 40s sat on the nearby sofa. They were Lewis's elder brother and sister-in-law, and also the parents of Jake. Although no one had introduced the identity of the petite old lady, anyone able to sit in a prominent position in the Horton family was definitely old Mrs. Horton. Poppy stood where she was, dumbfounded.
You...
She stuttered for a while but couldn't complete a sentence. Isla was about to collapse but was fortunately caught by Jake. Jake was puzzled.
What's wrong with you?
Isla's hands were trembling. She'd been striving for a connection with the Horton family all along and was painstakingly trying to please every elder here. But before she even entered the door, she had already offended old Mrs. Horton. She suddenly chuckled bitterly.
Keira, why did you trick us, saying old Mrs. Horton is your husband's grandmother? Due to that, how disrespectful to the old lady.
Keira instantly felt several suspicious glances directed at her in the room. Poppy, having recovered, scolded her.
You're such a liar. You know that Mrs. Horton is old, so you dare to deceive her. What do you take the Horton family for? Kneel and apologize immediately.
Kira's eyes darkened. They were trying to shift the blame, throwing all the fault onto her and absolving Isla in the process. What a good tactic. Smash! A teacup was thrown over by old Mrs. Horton, hitting Poppy. The boiling tea inside splashed onto her, but Poppy didn't dare to scream.
Shut up!
Mrs. Horton screamed in anger.
She's my granddaughter-in-law!
Despite enduring the pain of a burn, Poppy yelled.
Mrs. Horton, you've been deceived by her. I'm completely sure that her husband is just a little punk.
No need to argue. Why not just ask the parties involved? Jake's mother chimed in. Lewis, is she really the wife you're hiding and not bringing home? Keira glanced swiftly towards Lewis, and then she heard that expected response.
No.
The man, as always, was icy and emotionless. What an ungrateful, vindictive, mean person. A flash of resentment shot through Kira's eyes. Relief washed over Isla's face, and she sighed. Poppy sneered.
I knew all along that this was all Kira's doing.
Keira gave a cold snort and was about to retort, but instead heard the man's deep voice again.
It's my grandmother who mistook her. So I asked Miss Olsen to help take care of my grandmother for a while.
Keira didn't know what to say. All right, she admitted she was shouting a little too loud in her head when she cursed him just now. Everyone was quiet for a moment. No one expected this turn of events. After a while, Isla lowered her head.
So that's how it is. Keira, why didn't you tell us the truth? If you had, this misunderstanding wouldn't have happened.
Miss Isla.
Lewis relaxed on the couch, his posture casual, but his words struck with force.
Facing troubles by hiding behind others and shrinking your responsibilities, is this how the Olsen family raised its daughters?
Old Mrs. Horton, enlightened by his words, thundered.
You think I'm stupid since I have dementia. Do you think I can't see through these little tricks? You've made a mistake, but you're not repentant. Not only that, but you're trying to shift the blame onto others.
Old Mrs. Horton turned to Jake.
Call off the wedding. I don't want her as my granddaughter-in-law.
Isla was stunned. The marriage she'd worked so hard to secure couldn't just be gone like that. She looked toward Jake, but the man looked astonished, his gaze fixed on Keira, evidently still shocked by the news of her marriage. Isla clenched her fingers tight. Lowering her head, she walked to Jake, tears rolling down her face.
Jake, I was wrong. Rest assured, even if the marriage is cancelled, I'll still take you to the person I promised to introduce to you.
Jake came to his senses. Isla still wanted to introduce Dr. South to him. Currently in Creara's new energy projects, Dr. South was the top expert. He quickly spoke to old Mrs. Horton.
Great-grandmother, Isla really didn't know, so please forgive her. Besides, both families have already exchanged betrothal gifts. It's really not appropriate to call off the marriage.
Old Mrs. Horton gave him a meaningful look.
You're grown up now. I can't control you. Do as you please.
Old Mrs. Horton understood a profound truth. The older generation shouldn't act like an old meddler. The problems of the great-grandson should be solved by his parents, and she didn't want to interfere anymore. However, Jake's mother laughed. Grandma, have you forgotten about the welcome gift? Old Mrs. Horton lowered her eyes.
I'll have someone transfer $30,000 to Jake.
Jake's mother was stunned. But I remember you saying you'd give them 2% shares as a gift to ease their financial stress in their marriage. If you were to ask who was the wealthiest in the Horton family, it was definitely old Mrs. Horton. She was from a wealthy family in Clance and received a generous dowry when she married. Moreover, she controlled 20% of the Horton family's shares. Jake's mother had been wanting to take a slice from her through this marriage. Everything had been agreed upon, but old Mrs. Horton changed her mind at the last minute. Old Mrs. Horton looked at her with a half-laughing, half-serious look and retorted,
I'm dissatisfied with this great-granddaughter-in-law, so I won't give them any shares.
Isla's face turned pale. She felt humiliated. There were many servants in the Horton family, and these words would definitely spread. Soon the whole Oceanian would know that she'd been rejected by old Mrs. Horton. Nothing was more important to the daughter of a rich family than her reputation. Old Mrs. Horton might as well slap her in the face. Obviously, old Mrs. Horton didn't care about these things. Having made her statement, she immediately took Keira and Lewis back to her residence. Old Mrs. Horton then excused herself, saying she urgently needed to use the bathroom. She left Keira with Lewis alone themselves. In an instant, there were only the two of them left in the yard. The night was as dark as ink. Keira stood shoulder to shoulder with Lewis, only then realizing that the man was a head taller than her. He must be about 6 feet tall. Didn't the old lady say he was very thin and small when he was born? While she was slightly cursing him, Lewis suddenly looked at her, his eyebrows furrowing in disgust.
Need iron?
Keira wouldn't be outdone and also stared back at him.
Puppy?
Lewis's face turned green.
She has coaxed Grandma into telling her even that. She must have a hidden agenda. Perhaps Grandma's attachment to her was an accident without any calculation involved. But this woman willingly took Grandma in. Maybe it was because Grandma accidentally revealed her identity.
After Keira snapped at him, she didn't forget the main point.
I remember you said you would do me a favor. Could you go with me to the Civil Affairs Bureau to check on my marital status?
Lewis's face grew dark, and he snapped impatiently.
Fine. Then let's go. If it's not true, I hope you stop using Grandma as an excuse to pester me. No. All right.
Chapter 18. Marriage Certificate. Having heard their argument, the old lady poked her head out from the window.
Brat, are you upsetting my granddaughter-in-law?
Lewis's face tightened.
No.
The old lady cast a doubtful glance at Keira.
Granddaughter-in-law, is that true?
Keira gave Lewis a seemingly amused glare. She surprisingly noticed a trace of anxiousness on his otherwise expressionless face. She chuckled.
No, he's not upsetting me.
The man seemed to have a sigh of relief, although barely noticeable. Old Mrs. Horton chuckled.
Good. Dinner is ready. Come on in.
Their dinner was fairly simple. 4 dishes and 1 soup, just enough for 3 people. But the old lady barely had any appetite. She put down her fork after a few bites. She tiredly said,
Granddaughter-in-law, I'm tired. Let's go home.
Keira tried to persuade her.
Please, don't stress yourself. Rest here at home tonight.
The small courtyard was like a mini nursing home, equipped with all kinds of medical equipment. However, the old lady nervously clung onto Kira's hand.
Can you stay with me then?
Keira pursed her lips. She glanced at Lewis. In fact, she was also worried about the old lady. But considering how much Lewis loathed her and suspected her of using the old lady to get closer to him, he certainly wouldn't agree. The man fell silent, then said,
All right.
He then gave her a meaningful glance. His intention was clear. He was doing all this for his grandmother, and she shouldn't misconstrue anything. Keira gave a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. Old Mrs. Horton was satisfied.
All right. Wherever my granddaughter-in-law is, there I am.
After dinner, Keira helped old Mrs. Horton back to her room to rest. The old lady must have been really tired today after making a scene when she fell ill. She fell asleep as soon as she took hold of Kira's hand. She was having an extremely restless sleep. As soon as Keira let go of her hand, the old lady began groping around in her sleep, mumbling,
Granddaughter-in-law.
Keira was helpless and could only sit by the bed, keeping her company. Outside the window, Lewis had a serious expression on his face.
What's going on with Grandma?
The family doctor, who had studied psychology, sighed.
Although I didn't know why old Mrs. Horton recognized this girl, I can more or less guess why she's so restless. She's afraid that her granddaughter-in-law will leave.
Why?
The family doctor gave Lewis a glance.
It seems like old Mrs. Horton feels like she wouldn't be able to survive this year. She's afraid if she's gone, you'll end up with no constraints. And granddaughter-in-law is the only person she could leave behind to keep you company.
Lewis was slightly startled. His dark eyes reflected suppressed emotions for a while before settling back into calmness. He stood in the moonlight, seeming as if he was going to blend completely into the darkness behind him. No one knew how much time had elapsed before the man suddenly turned around and walked towards the main house in big strides. For Isla, this meal was very difficult to get through. The first branch of the family had lost 2% of the shares because of her. Jake's mother, Melissa Knight, was extremely dissatisfied and made cutting remarks towards Isla.
Isn't Keira a legitimate daughter? How come she can get into the good graces of old Mrs. Horton, but you can't?
Isla could only lower her head in apology.
Auntie, I'm not as sweet-tongued as her. I don't know how to flatter other people.
Melissa snorted in contempt.
I don't care what method you use, but you have to get those 2% shares back. Otherwise, don't even think about stepping into the Horton family.
Isla was left with her inner grievances untold. She was finally able to ask for leave after going through the hard ordeal of finishing her meal. But before she could leave, Lewis returned. The man was tall, and his presence filled the room with a strong, oppressive aura the moment he entered. His gaze was sharp as a torch, and after sweeping over the leftover food on the dining table, his face soured even more. Old Mrs. Horton didn't get to eat anything tonight, and they're here satisfying themselves? Melissa didn't dare to speak when she saw his face. It was Jake's father, Oliver Horton, who frowned and asked,
Lewis, what brings you here?
Lewis ignored his namesake older brother and instead turned to Isla.
Since the marriage isn't off, she's considered part of the Horton family as of now, right?
Everyone was left puzzled.
Yes?
In that case, she has to follow the rules of the Horton family. She has shown disrespect to her elders today, therefore she is to kneel in the ancestral hall for a night.
Lewis gave a signal without further explanation, and 2 bodyguards walked up toward Isla.
Mrs. Olsen, please come with us.
Isla was dumbstruck. Kneeling for the whole night in the ancestral hall? As a pampered child from a very young age, how could she bear that? She sought help from Jake, but she saw that he didn't dare to rebel against the person in power. She took a deep breath and had no choice but to follow the bodyguards. Just as she was about to step out, she heard Jake ask,
Uncle Lewis, where is Keira? Has she left?
Then she heard the man's warning reply,
She's my guest and staying at Horton's tonight.
Isla followed the bodyguards to the ancestral hall. The bodyguard said,
Mr. Horton has instructed us since you haven't married into the family, you cannot enter the Horton family ancestral hall, so just kneel outside.
Outside was a paved area made of green bricks. Isla wanted to say something, but the 2 bodyguards seemed to stand tall like gatekeepers, their cold eyes watching her.
Miss Olsen, please.
The weather in October was already quite chilly at night. Isla was shivering. The bone-piercing cold seeped into her bones from her kneecaps. She wanted to slacken a bit, but those two bodyguards stared at her intently as if they were prison guards. They didn't say a word, but still, their silence made one shudder. On recalling that at this very moment, Keira must be lying on a warm and soft bed, Isla gritted her teeth in hatred. But Keira would only stay with the Horton family for a night, while Isla could stay here for a lifetime in the future. She was about to meet with Dr. South soon, and she had to make good use of this card. When Keira woke up, she found herself lying in bed. There was also a small gray blanket placed over her, which didn't match the interior of the old lady's room. She didn't think much of it. After getting up and freshening up, she had breakfast with old Mrs. Horton and Lewis. A plate of donuts was placed on the dining table. Old Mrs. Horton immediately picked one up. Lewis frowned. His grandma had high blood sugar, and it wasn't suitable for her to eat foods high in fat and sugar like these. As he was thinking of how to dissuade her, he heard Keira say plainly,
Grandma, these donuts aren't suitable for you.
Right after that, the old lady, who was picky about her food and liked to eat whatever she pleased, diverted her hand in midair and put the donut into Kira's bowl.
Granddaughter-in-law, I was getting it for you.
Old Mrs. Horton smiled at her pleasantly. Lewis was speechless. He looked at Keira scrupulously, unable to understand why Grandma was so willing to listen to her. Keira started to eat the donut unreservedly. She then looked at Lewis.
By the way, bring your ID card and household registration book when we go to the Civil Affairs Bureau later.
Old Mrs. Horton asked curiously.
What are you going to the Civil Affairs Bureau for?
Keira answered casually.
We lost the marriage certificate, so we need a new one.
A marriage certificate was needed for a divorce, and she wasn't just fobbing old Mrs. Horton off. However, much to her surprise, upon hearing this, old Mrs. Horton quickly retorted,
It's not lost.
She hurriedly went into the bedroom and swiftly brought back 2 red marriage certificates before handing them to Keira and Lewis. Chapter 19. She Has Always Known. Keira stared dumbfounded at the marriage certificate in her hand. She suddenly realized that the first time old Mrs. Horton saw her, she called her granddaughter-in-law. The old lady had known all along that Keira and Lewis were married. Keira felt that she had found a clue. She immediately asked,
Grandma, how did you come by this marriage certificate?
Old Mrs. Horton was taken aback, her eyes growing a touch bewildered.
I can't really remember.
Keira continued.
How did Mr. Horton and I come to be married?
Old Mrs. Horton just shook her head.
I don't recall.
Keira grew somewhat anxious.
Grandma, please try to think back.
Enough.
Lewis said unhappily, his towering figure standing between the 2 women. His eyes were cold when he asked,
Miss Olsen, is this certificate real?
Of course.
Lewis's face darkened.
Are you going to say we don't need to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau now?
So that was her aim. She used a legitimate excuse like going to the Civil Affairs Bureau as a setup, then lured his grandma into taking out this fake certificate and tricking him into believing it was true. If he hadn't seen how his grandma just did as she was told, he might have believed Keira. Keira sensed the hostility in the man's tone and found it baffling.
We don't have to go today.
Divorce isn't something that could be resolved by just stopping by the Civil Affairs Bureau. For 2 years, they were legally husband and wife, so there were a lot of property distribution issues to deal with. They needed to sign a divorce agreement first.
No.
After Lewis spoke, he carefully observed Keira. She was slightly taken aback. Then she said nonchalantly,
Whatever you say.
He wondered if she was too confident in her acting that she wouldn't give up until the last moment. Or was this marriage certificate genuine? Lewis was suddenly unsure. He simply picked up the marriage certificate and headed out.
I'll wait for you in the parking lot.
Keira smiled reassuringly at the old lady, then followed Lewis out. The man walked quickly, and she almost had to trot to keep up with him. When they arrived at the parking lot, they saw Poppy standing there with an ashen-faced Isla, who was shaking and sneezing. Poppy seemed heartbroken. On seeing Keira, Poppy's eyes lit up.
Keira!
She quickly walked over, cautiously avoiding Lewis. She stood before Keira and said self-righteously,
You must help your sister.
Keira raised an eyebrow. She didn't understand why the two were out so early in the morning. Didn't they leave last night? Before she could speak, Poppy was already rambling.
Keira, you're an illegitimate child, but the Olsen family didn't mind your background and raised you. For all the hardship they went through, you should reciprocate for the Olsen family. Your sister has been even better to you. Not only did she let you go to school with her, but she also shared her clothes with you. And also, you were so weak when you were born that you wouldn't have survived. I didn't have any milk, so you only survived because you took the milk that was supposed to be for your sister. Back then, the Olsen family hadn't intended to take us in. Mrs. Olsen and your father only decided to keep us because you and your sister were born the same day. So, you owe your sister. You should repay her kindness all your life.
Keira hadn't heard those words in 10 years. When she was little, she believed these lies and worked like a horse for the Olsen family. She let Isla bully her. How ridiculous. Indeed, the Olsen family had raised her, but parents having to raise a child was a legal obligation. If they hadn't taken care of her, they would have been guilty of desertion. She did go to school with Isla Olsen, but she had to carry Isla's school on their way to school and back home. She also had to be Olsen's servant at school. If Isla happened to cough one day, it was Keira's fault for not taking good care of her, and she would get beaten by Poppy. In school, she could only get the last place in exams because she couldn't outshine Isla. And the clothes. Her parents never prepared any for her. She could only wear Isla's hand-me-downs, hence her clothes were always a bit too small. Mrs. Olsen did buy her a new dress once, but as soon as she put it on, it was taken off by Poppy and given to Isla, stating that she wasn't good enough. She couldn't be prettier than Isla. As for being weak, which baby wouldn't be weak after being starved for 5 days? The mockery in Keira's eyes grew more intense, but Poppy didn't sense her emotions at all. After saying those things, she immediately added,
Now that you've grown up, you finally have a chance to repay the Olsen family. Keira, old Mrs. Horton listens to you, right? Ask her to return the 2% of the shares to your sister.
Keira looked down and laughed.
You're darn right.
Poppy's face lit up, thinking she had convinced Keira, only to hear the girl's indifferent voice a moment later.
I'm just a low-born illegitimate daughter. How could old Mrs. Horton possibly listen to me?
Poppy froze, wanting to say something else, but Keira had already walked past her and got into Lewis's car.
Let's go.
Lewis was speechless. He looked at the girl sitting in the back seat, thinking about telling her that the driver hadn't arrived yet. But then Poppy seemed to try to run the car. Lewis sat behind the wheel and closed the door. He then slowly fastened his seatbelt before starting the car and driving off. The black Bentley drove smoothly. Lewis looked back at the girl through his rearview mirror. She was staring at the passing scenery outside the window. Her exquisite and beautiful face was calm. He looked away and continued driving. He had planned to warn her, but in the end, he didn't say anything. The car quickly arrived at the Civil Affairs Bureau. As soon as he stopped, Tom knocked on the driver's side window. Lewis rolled down the window, and Tom's voice came through.
Boss, the driver said you took the car yourself, and it scared me, so I followed the GPS. Did something happen?
No.
Lewis was as sparing with his words as ever. Tom looked at the Civil Affairs Bureau.
Why did you come here? Don't tell me you were bothered by Keira Olsen that you became paranoid. Don't worry, I told you, she can't see you again. If she does, then I will...
Live stream eating shit?
Before Tom could finish, he heard a lazy female voice. He stiffened and slowly looked at the back seat to find Keira with a teasing look in her eyes.
Which live stream channel do you use?
Tom was completely stunned. The three of them entered the Civil Affairs Bureau and approached the service window. Tom took the lead and asked,
Hi, I have an inquiry. Can one pick up the marriage certificate without the persons involved being present?
The clerk said.
Absolutely not.
Did you hear that?
Tom looked at Keira mockingly, glancing at the marriage certificate in her hands before he sneered.
You've prepared a fake certificate. Nice, I will report you for forgery and harassment now.
However, Lewis handed over the marriage certificate.
Excuse me, could you please check if this marriage certificate is genuine?
Chapter 20. Why Are We Married? The staff member gave him a strange look, took the marriage certificate, and began inputting information into the computer. Lewis pursed his lips. He suddenly found his actions absurd. Despite being certain that he wasn't married, he had somehow ended up here. He even missed a very important meeting for it. The staff member soon gave him the answer.
It's genuine.
Lewis was surprised. Hearing the staff member's words, Tom cried out involuntarily.
How did that possible? Did you get the date entry wrong?
The staff member glared at him.
What are you talking about? Marriage is a serious matter. We have to confirm both parties' identities meticulously, and they have to sign a guarantee.
A guarantee? Keira asked.
Can we take a look at our guarantee?
Lewis spoke at the same time. The two exchanged a glance and quickly looked away. The staff member reluctantly stood up.
You two do have chemistry as a couple. All right, I'll go get it for you.
He soon returned with the registration documents. From them, he pulled out the guarantee and handed it over to Keira and Lewis. Keira realized that the handwriting on it was indeed hers. Tom also cried out,
Boss, this is your handwriting.
Keira thought for a moment and then looked at the surveillance cameras.
Excuse me, can we take a look at the recording from the day we registered?
The staff member replied.
Sorry, we only keep recordings for 6 months.
The staff member continually assured them that the marriage certificate would only be issued if both parties were present, and they never made mistakes. The three of them eventually left the Civil Affairs Bureau in resignation. Standing at the entrance, Tom asked in confusion.
Boss, what do we do now?
Lewis pondered. Keira raised her eyebrows.
I want a
divorce.
They spoke in unison again. Tom was startled, then asked,
Do we do it now? Should we discuss the terms of the divorce?
Talk to my lawyer.
I will have my lawyer contact you.
Lewis and Keira spoke at the same time again. After both had finished speaking, they couldn't help but look at each other. Keira laughed and said straightforwardly,
Why don't we each have our lawyers draft an agreement to review first? If there's an issue, let the lawyers talk.
Tom laughed scornfully.
You can't afford a lawyer?
However, Lewis nodded in agreement. Ignoring Tom, Keira took out her phone again.
Mr. Horton, can I add you on WhatsApp? I'll make communication easier.
Lewis hesitated for a moment before taking out his phone. He opened WhatsApp and told Keira his ID. Then a chat box appeared on her phone with a note that read, Grandson. His face suddenly darkened. Keira was speechless. She had forgotten that they had already added each other on WhatsApp. Ignoring the man's scowl, she cleared his throat.
I randomly made a note of your ID at the time. I'll change it.
She shielded her screen and changed grandson to puppy. Then she said,
Catch you later.
Before hailing a cab and left. Watching her leave, Tom hesitated before looking at Lewis.
Boss, you two really are married, right?
The two had just seemed too in sync. Lewis gave him a look.
Find the best divorce lawyer and draft a contract to protect my assets outside.
Tom stood up straight.
Yes.
After he finished speaking, Tom realized something.
I know what's going on. The marriage thing is definitely that woman's scheme. Now that she can't win your heart, she decided to have a piece of your money. No wonder she has no money to hire a lawyer to battle you in a divorce lawsuit. Even if she takes only a little, the lawyer will get quite a high salary.
Tom gritted his teeth in anger.
Don't worry, I will make sure she won't take a penny from you.
Make sure he won't take a penny from me.
In the taxi, Keira was also talking to Samuel.
Find the best divorce lawyer.
No problem.
Samuel said,
Boss, what's the deal with your marriage? Neither you or Lewis Horton can remember it. Surely, you can't both get amnesia, right?
Keira calmly responded.
Do you think this is a novel?
Samuel said.
I was just curious. It's both absurd and exciting. It would be nice if the Civil Affair Bureau just sent me a wife one day.
Keira sighed quietly and only responded after a moment.
There's someone who definitely knows what's going on.
Who?
Old Mrs. Horton.
Didn't she lose her memory?
Is the clinical medicine for treating Alzheimer's still in experimental stage?
She frowned.
Speed it up, or I'll be too late.
What will be too late?
Keira didn't answer this question. She arrived home shortly after. As she opened the door to enter the family room, she suddenly found the small 2-bedroom apartment a bit empty. At that moment, the old lady walked into the hallway with a suitcase.
Granddaughter-in-law, you're back. I've been waiting for you for a long time. This time, I brought a lot of clothes with me.
Keira was surprised for a moment before she smiled. That day, the most famous divorce law firm in Oceanian and its most famous lawyer received 2 divorce agreement drafting commissions. Both parties were anonymous, and the requests were the other party cannot be taken away my money, not even a penny. The conditions were extremely strict. The assistant lawyer complained.
I have seen many divorces, but never one this ruthless. One is the male and the other female. Men and women are equally ruthless when they have their hearts set.
Having seen every case of loving couples turning bitter enemies, the lawyer found nothing too shocking. He chuckled.
One contract, double the money, get prepared and send it to your employers.
At Horton Group on the top floor. Since returning from the Civil Affairs Bureau, Lewis had been busy. By the time he received a call from home saying that Grandma had gone looking for her granddaughter-in-law again, it was almost time to go home. Grandma needed a body check every day to ensure all her vitals. He furrowed his brows, subconsciously opened WhatsApp, and found Need Iron. He wanted to send a message, but didn't know what to say. It seemed ever since he found out that Need Iron was Keira, he had been feeling awkward. He casually scrolled through their chat history. The conversations they had before were very casual, like old friends, especially when he joined her to say bad things about her enemy. Wait, wasn't the person she insulted that day at the restaurant himself? Lewis's face darkened again. At that moment, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Need Iron. She had sent him a divorce contract.
Mr. Horton, the property division part of the agreement is my bottom line. Can you check if it's acceptable?
Property division. Did this woman scheme to marry him just for his money? Just as Lewis opened the contract, the door was pushed open and Tom walked in.
Boss, I have some results on the investigation into your marriage.